impact of looking at this airplane burning up was what impacted me. I just could not believe this airplane, in that short a time, had turned into that raging fire. Peter Jennings personally told me that it was the worst sight he had ever seen.
The other, the KLM, the Royal Dutch Airline, smashed into each other, thereby triggering the greatest catastrophe in the history of civil aviation.
It was a situation where I think a pilot, and he was their best pilot, I think he just got in too big of a hurry.
Alpha 1736, report runway clear. Okay, we'll report when we're clear.
It's the only time in my life I have ever saw something happening that I could not believe was happening.
At least 560 people are dead.
Count 576 victims.
There are at least 578 dead.
The death toll now standing at 599 people.
There are still almost 600 people dead tonight, and it looks like it was simply the result of a lack of communication.
2 American-built 747 jumbo jetliners crashed over a runway in the Canary Islands.
The 2 planes were charter flights and packed with tourists.
The Dutch 747, within a few miles an hour of takeoff speed, tried to pull up to get airborne to clear the Pan Am ship.
It was the worst disaster in aviation history.
The worst disaster in aviation history.
The cause of the worst plane crash in history.
For the worst aviation disaster ever.
Well, Harriet, there's a mixture of confusion here, tremendous sadness, and strange enough, rather a calm among some people. And I asked one survivor if he was always calm or if in fact he thought he might still be in shock. I think most of them feel that they're still in shock, that the realization of this terrible tragedy hasn't hit them.
When the airlines put the Boeing 747 into service 7 years ago, insurance experts trying to set a reasonable rate predicted there might be 2 disastrous crashes of the huge planes in the first 18 months of service. The crashes didn't happen. The 747 safety record has been outstanding. Yesterday, the averages caught up with the 747, 2 of them, both on charter flights, both on the ground, collided at Tenerife Airport in the Canary Islands.
Without exception and without doubt, my favorite airplane was the 747. It was a magnificent airplane. It was gigantic, and I flew the airplane over 20 years, and I never lost the awe of the size of the airplane. Every time I walked up to it, I thought to myself, what a gigantic airplane. I mentioned this to a lot of people. The bigger the airplane it is, the easier it is to fly. And that's logical because it's got the best equipment on it, it's got redundancy. Most items are doubled and many of them are tripled. So it's a fantastic airplane. I will have to say it, when I got the trip, I had no idea where the Canary Islands were. I had to go get an atlas to see where we were going. Las Palmas is one of the main islands in the Canary chain of islands. And the Canary Islands are approximately 220 miles off the west coast of Africa. And if you look at an atlas, look for Casablanca, and then look a little bit west and a little bit south, and you'll see the Canary Islands.
The Pan Am and KLM jumbo jets were diverted to Tenerife yesterday after a terrorist bomb explosion at the Canary Islands main airport in Las Palmas.
A group that is seeking independence from Spain for the Canary Islands, of course Las Palmas is one of the Canaries, says it planted the bomb.
When we were descending into Las Palmas, our flight was at 33,000 feet. When we were descending and when we came through 12,000 feet, we received a radio call from Tenerife Approach Control. We received basically a command to turn right, proceed to Tenerife. The captain says, inform them that we would rather hold, which basically means circle in a particular space, instead of diverting and going to Tenerife, which I did. I told them that we would request holding versus diversion to Tenerife. And they said, negative, you will turn right and proceed to Tenerife, switch frequencies and contact the air traffic control tower at Tenerife. So we asked later on why of the diversion, and it was because of a terrorist bomb that had been exploded at the check-in counters at Las Palmas. And they had threats of a second bomb, and they didn't know anything about where it was going to be, so they just basically closed the airport, which was probably a good decision on their part. So when we landed, they gave us taxi instructions that took us down to the west end of the ramp area, and we were placed in a holding area because no one knew when the airport was going to open. While we were there, the captain elected to open the cockpit door and allow the passengers to come up and look in the cockpit and ask any question they wanted. And it's typically very interesting for people who aren't pilots to come up and see the cockpit and see how everything goes on up there. KLM had just started refueling probably 5 minutes before we received the word that the airport at Las Palmas had reopened. So when I asked KLM how long it would take him, and he said approximately 35 minutes, the captain asked the flight engineer, George Warnes, and myself to go out and measure the wingtip difference between the KLM left wing and the Pan Am right wing, because that's the way we were positioned. Engineer and I went out and measured, paced off the distance, and we were 12 feet short of being able to get around the KLM airplane. So when I went back and forwarded that information to the captain, Victor Grubbs, he made the comment, well, now we are forced to wait on KLM. So about 30 minutes later, we looked at KLM, and I saw 2 passengers leave his airplane with their bags. Turned out these were the only 2 people that would survive the accident. Their final destination was Tenerife, so they elected to get off the airplane in Tenerife. They were the only 2 people that survived. Captain Van Zandt, the captain of the KLM airplane, started his engines immediately after refueling. We started approximately 5 minutes after he did. We heard KLM call and request start and taxi clearance, which he received.
KLM 4805 is now on the runway. 4805, roger. Approach, he wants us to turn left at Charlie 1, taxiway Charlie 1. Negative, negative. Taxi straight ahead up to the end of the runway and make backtrack. Okay, sir.
Their taxi clearance was basically to taxi down the runway, which is commonly referred to as backtracking. This is a very, very common procedure. It is nothing unusual to have to backtrack down a runway. And as you can imagine, any place in the world where they've only got one runway, if you're at one end of the runway and you have to get back to the other end, you have to backtrack down the runway. Now, let me distinguish takeoff clearance, taxi clearance, and ATC clearance. The ATC clearance, or the air traffic control clearance, is the routing clearance. It basically gives the pilot information on how he gets from his departure point to his destination. Gives him the routing and the altitude that he flies at. That's your ATC clearance. A taxi clearance is basically that. It's the clearance to taxi the airplane to the point typically short of the active runway. And then the takeoff clearance, once again, is exactly that. It is the clearance to take off on a particular runway. And our taxi instructions were basically follow KLM, backtrack down runway 12, and that was the taxi clearances. So we were following KLM. At that time, the visibility was unlimited. We could see the entire width of the island. So when we were taxiing, we had KLM in sight the entire time until the fog bank came down off of the mountains on both sides of the airport. And it was weird looking because it came down and stopped right on the runway and didn't continue past the runway. It stopped on the runway. The visibility had been unlimited up until that time, and the visibility went from unlimited to 500 meters.
The KLM 4805 is now ready to take off, and we're waiting for our ATC clearance.
KLM 8705, you're clear to the Papa Beacon, climb to and maintain flight level 9 Right, and after takeoff, proceed with heading 040 until intercepting the 325 radial from Las Palmas de Mar.
Roger, sir, we're clear to the Papa Beacon. Flight level 90, right turn out 040, and intercepting the 325. And we are now takeoff.
Okay. Okay, for takeoff, I will call you.
When you re-emphasize that the co-pilot said, "We're at takeoff," that's not a normal call. When I heard that, I even made the comment over the radio, Clippers 1736 is still on the runway.
Morning, the Clipper 1736.
Papa Alpha 1736, report runway clear.
Okay, we'll report runway clear.
Thank you.
When we first saw the KLM airplane, it didn't surprise us too much because we were aware that he was down there. And the first thing that got my attention was his landing lights were on. And that's one of the very last things that a pilot does when you receive the takeoff clearance. You reach up and turn the lights on. So that's probably the last thing you do on your checklist before you release the brakes and start your takeoff roll. So that got my attention to start with. Then, due to the low visibility, 500 meters, it was very obvious the airplane was moving and coming at us. And my initial reaction was, I said very loudly, "I think he's moving." And then it was very obvious that he was moving. And the captain had seen the same situation as I had, and he had pushed the throttles to full power. But when he saw the KLM airplane coming at him, he tried to get the airplane turned. So he went to full power, turned the airplane, which turned out later to be about 27 degrees. And as we were turning, I looked back out of my right side window, and KLM had lifted off the ground. And I could see his red rotating beacon on the belly of the airplane.
Roger, sir, we're clear to the Papa Beacon. Flight level 90, right turn out 040, and intercepting the 325. And we are now takeoff.
Okay. Okay, for takeoff, I will call you.
Morning, the Clipper 1736.
Papa Alpha 1736, report runway clear.
Okay, we'll report runway clear.
Thank you.
It's the only time in my life I have ever saw something happening that I could not believe was happening. And I basically ducked, closed my eyes, and when the KLM airplane hit us, I really didn't even think the man had hurt us because it was a very slight impact, very slight noise, like, that was about it. It was so minor, it was unbelievable. Until I opened my eyes and looked up. First thing I noticed was all of the windows were gone in the cockpit. Then I looked out to the right, and the right wing was on fire. Then I looked back to the left, and on this particular configuration airplane, we had an upstairs lounge with 28 passengers in it. When I looked back, the lounge and all the people were gone. There was no flooring left or anything else, and I could see all the way to the tail of the airplane, just like someone had taken a big knife and sliced the entire top of the cabin of the airplane off. Not only was the top gone, the flight engineer's panel, which is right back of the pilots on the right side of the airplane, was missing, and that's a fairly big panel. It's approximately 5 feet by 5 feet. I also noticed that the 2 jump seats were missing, and we had 2 jump seat riders, which was the ops rep and the mechanic that had come over from Las Palmas to support our flight. They were missing. I couldn't see them at all. Turned out later on that they were, when they did what I did. They closed their eyes and ducked, And when they opened their eyes, they were dangling upside down from the ceiling of the first class section of the airplane. But they thought and reached over and grabbed the side of the airplane before they released their seat belts. It was about that time that I figured it was time to get out of the cockpit. And as before I said get off to the captain. This time I was saying get out. I was saying get out, get out, get out. And I stood up, and when the co-pilot stands up, you face to the left to get out of the airplane, get out of the seat. There was only a foot of the floor left, so I reached and grabbed a hold of the back of the captain's seat and just jumped right over the side. And it's approximately 48 feet, but at that time I gave no consideration to the height above the ground. I think I hold that distinction, being the only man that's ever jumped out, and I hope I'm the only one who'll ever have to. The last thing I remember that hearing the airplane do before the KLM airplane hit us was the nose gear dropping off of the runway onto the ground. So luckily, when I jumped out of the top of the airplane, I hit on the grass and rolled, and I think I sprained my ankle. First thing I saw was one of the passengers, and probably from the upstairs lounge. And this lady was on her knees, and all of her clothes were burnt off of her, and all her hair and everything was just singeing, basically. And I walked over to the lady and I said, "Everything will be okay." That's the only thing I could think to say to her. And she basically just collapsed. And then the impact of looking at this airplane burning up is what impacted me. I just could not believe this airplane in that short a time had turned into that raging fire. Next thing I noticed was the radome, or the nose of the airplane, just dropped off the airplane. Also, I noticed that by that length of time, which couldn't have been over several minutes after the accident, the entire left wing of the airplane had filled up with passengers. Now, you've got to kind of picture this, because the engines were going at full speed and were extremely loud, but the wing was full of passengers just standing there. So I went back up as close as I could and started yelling and motioning for them to jump, and they did. They did exactly what they were supposed to. They jumped right off the wing. Now, that's fairly high also. That's like 25 feet. They jumped off with the exception of one lady, and she jumped and slid down the side of one of the engines. It was the right side of the number 2 engine, and burned herself very badly. Most of the other people just jumped straight from the wing out onto the grass. And I was motioning for them to get away from the airplane, because I expected the airplane the wings and the entire airplane to blow up.
I jumped, I sat on the part of the wing, almost falling backwards. But anyway, I caught myself, and so I had to jump, landing on my feet, which I did. I'm afraid I landed on somebody's back. I hope and pray that they were saved. And I saw one man pulling a lady by the ankle, running as fast as he could, and it was strange. And I asked myself, why is he doing that way? Turned out this lady I talked to both of them the next day. Turned out that this was his wife, and when she jumped, she was one of the first jumpers, and everybody hit on top of her. And it broke both arms, both legs, and her back. And as soon as her husband discovered that she couldn't walk, he grabbed her by the ankle and just started running as fast as he could. But he accomplished what he wanted to do. He got away from the airplane. Center fuel tank exploded and shot a flame and smoke into the air, probably 200 to 300 feet high. Gigantic flame came out. And it shot a huge piece of metal. I have no idea what it was, but it came right over toward me, and I watched it go over and hit in a field back of me. And about that time, the airplane just collapsed. This is a piece of molten metal that was given to the captain by the Pan Am Vice President of Operations as what was remaining of one piece of what was remaining in the airplane. As you can see, it's molten aluminum. So the fire was very intensive. As a matter of fact, it burned
everything in the airplane. Baggage, there was nothing left of the airplane. There are pictures that show that very well. They were basically running away from the airplane, and I was trying to enforce that attitude in them. I was telling them to get away as fast as they possibly could. Then something very interesting happened. I stopped, and I thought the passengers were still standing there, and I wondered myself, why in the world aren't they getting away from this airplane? And I stopped and looked, and it turned out these were civilians, people that had lived around the airport, that had on their own initiative climbed the fence, come out to the accident site, and were helping. They were helping pick people up. I saw one of these people carry a man on his back. So they were doing just any and everything. It must have been 50 or 75 of them. So basically they were helping the people get away, and as soon as they got them away, they'd come back and help other people get away. And by that time, and that was probably within 5 minutes after the accident, there was absolute silence. You could, in the very beginning, people were screaming and yelling, as you can imagine in any type of accident, but it was utter silence. And that was a big surprise to me. I later on asked our medical director what would have caused that, and his explanation was when you have a fire that gigantic and that big, the fire takes all of the oxygen out of there and people basically suffocate. And they will do that in less than 2 minutes. So they were alive 1 minute, and then within 2 minutes they had suffocated, and that's why there was absolute silence. About that time, I saw the two jump seat gentlemen, and they came up to me, and they, as I wondered what had happened, that was their first question to me, what do you think happened? And I guess that was the first time I made my comment about I think KLM took off without a clearance. I've always thought that. I think that to today. And then when we walked around the airplane, when I saw the two jump seat riders, the three of us walked entirely around the airplane. I think that's when it was very obvious to us how many people had probably not survived that crash, because number one, the debris field on a big airplane is gigantic. Now let me explain what a debris field is. A debris field is basically everything in the airplane that gets thrown out on the ground. It can be magazines, it can be clothes, it can be anything that's in the cabin of the airplane. This debris field was extensive. It was probably 200 to 300 yards long, so it was just a mass of things. And naturally, it's an eerie subject, but there were an awful lot of bodies of people that were around that you could see. They made a temporary morgue in one of the, it's an extremely large hangar. Peter Jennings personally told me that it was the worst sight he had ever seen, to see that many people laid out in, in a situation like a morgue. So we went back around, and at that time, I did not know what had happened to KLM. Because KLM had hit us, it turns out, we found out this later, had hit us, severed his landing gear on our airplane. As a matter of fact, they found his landing gear in our wreckage. He exploded and hit 1,500 feet down the runway. No one came down to our site. And that was one of the things that I was wondering about. Why in the world hadn't somebody come down to assist and help us? Then the first thing I saw was a taxi cab pull up. And I thought to myself then that I must have gone to the big airline in the sky, because it was just so unusual to see a taxi cab. They opened the gates of the airport and ordered the taxi cabs to come out to these two airplanes. Then while I was standing there, a gentleman in a suit came up to me, and they call all pilots, I guess, captain. He said, Captain, I was a co-pilot. He said, Captain, we got everything under control. He bodily opened the taxi cab door and pushed me into the taxi cab. The taxi cab took off, got back to the terminal, the door opened, somebody bodily pulled me out of the taxi cab and bodily threw me into another taxi cab, and that taxi cab took off. The guy was going so fast, I had to ask him to slow down. I mean, he was probably going 100 miles an hour down these streets to get me to the hospital. And when I got to the emergency room, I found the captain, Vic Grubbs, and naturally we discussed what we thought had happened, and we couldn't believe what had happened. And I think the captain, the flight engineer, and myself probably had a consensus of opinion that KLM had taken off without a clearance. And I was very specific in telling the captain I thought he had done everything he possibly could. And I said if it wouldn't have been for him, probably no one would have gotten out of the airplane, which I feel, because if you would hit us straight on, I don't think anybody would have gotten out of the Pan Am airplane. At one point, they were all in my room, a representative from the NTSB, the FAA, Boeing, Pratt & Whitney, KLM, the Spanish Airport Authority, and the room was packed, as you can imagine. And they just said, well, tell us what you think, and I did. I had my 10 pages of notes. I said, if you like, I'll read you the notes, and that's what they wanted, so I read them the 10 pages of notes. And one of the KLM attorneys, which I'll never understand why, popped up and said, looks like our man took off without a clearance. I said, I bet he hears about that later on, because he admitted it in front of everybody. I think probably the biggest lesson, and I think it's something that can never be forgotten, is that this particular pilot, and he was their best pilot, he was their #1 Czech pilot, a training captain, training instructor. Pilots do not cause accidents by choice. I mean, I think that's obvious. I think it was a simple case of the gentleman trying to do as good a job as he possibly could, and he got in a hurry. And I think any time in any profession, especially aviation, it just doesn't pay to get in an extremely big hurry. I think, and we all have a tendency to do it, I think you have to come up with some type of program, self-motivator or whatever, just to calm yourself down and make absolutely sure that you not only check, but you double check and you triple check things. And when you make mistakes, you have very disastrous results, as this accident proved.
This film is dedicated to Captain Victor Grubbs, his wife May, all of the crew and passengers on both planes, those that survived and those that didn't. To all the citizens of the island of Tenerife, who did everything humanly possible to aid and assist those involved in the accident. Finally, to the gentleman who on that day was in charge of the airport control tower, who was in no way responsible for the accident.